There you go. All righty, folks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is good to see you all here. I see that the attendees are entering this webinar. We will start in a moment. I'd like to inform you that we are recording this special online event. We'll start in a moment, allow more people to join us. There's a wonderful list there. I see a couple of very familiar and very important names there. And there's more joining us. Wonderful. This is great. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We have a fantastic program for you today, and we'll start in a moment. All righty, folks. Welcome, 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 welcome. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of visual studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Visual Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Avis Koyman and Srushi Suresh for all their assistance behind the scenes. Whatever they do, anything they do, makes this and all other events possible. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today for a brilliant first webinar of the semester titled Inside Israeli Politics, Challenges and Shifts 2025, featuring award-winning journalist Tal Schneider, whom I'll introduce in a moment. I'd like to mention that our next webinar is titled October 7th, Israel and the United States, 2 years later, featuring Dr. Chuck Freilich. This will take place online on Thursday, October 9th at 6 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Now, Israeli politics has always been dynamic. Some would say turbulent, but the developments of the past few years have been particularly dramatic, I would argue. Israelis went to the polls 5 times between 2019 and 2022. The events revolving around the judicial overhaul or reform, obviously the October 7th attack, the ongoing war in Gaza and beyond, shifting coalition politics, realignment of politicians in the opposition and in the coalition, deepening social divides, and the evolving role of religion and security are reshaping not only Israel's political map, but also its relationship with the wider world. If this is not enough, in the last couple of days, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech in the United Nations General Assembly, and US President Donald Trump announced a 20-point plan to end the war in Gaza and bring peace to the Middle East. These events have multiple meanings, certainly, but they also carry a profound political meaning inside Israel. Today, we'll step back perhaps from the headlines to explore what these shifts, developments, and changes mean, what remains constant, what is changing, and how Israeli politics in 2025 is responding to pressures from both within and outside the country's borders. Now, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, senior political and diplomatic correspondent for the Times of Israel, an award-winning journalist, Tal Schneider. And I cannot overstate how happy and fortunate we are to host her today, albeit virtually. I just learned that she lived in the DMV for quite a long time. So from one neighbor to another, welcome back to the DMV. Welcome back to Maryland. She's one of the most prolific and perceptive Israeli journalists today, I would argue. And as the audience probably knows by now, I'm not very active on social media, but if you'd like to receive real-time and first-class analysis of Israeli politics and diplomatic affairs, I highly recommend following Tal's Twitter or X account at Tal Schneider. I think it's brilliant, and you'll be spoon-fed almost, kind of the most important, the most critical information ever. Tal will give kind of an opening introduction just to frame the conversation, and then we'll engage one another in kind of in a dialogue. But most important, perhaps, as far as I'm concerned, is that there's a Q&A box in the bottom of the screen. So please take advantage of that and type your questions. I think that both she and I will benefit from adding your insights, your comments, and everything that it goes in between. Tal, the floor is yours. Go ahead, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you for those really, really warm words. And I appreciate you inviting me. It's definitely a critical point in time about Israel's history and about our political future. You know, politics may be sometimes step towards here, step towards there. But what we saw last night in Washington, D.C. is really an important event that may influence this country dramatically and also may influence politics. But, you know, more than influencing Israeli politics, is important to influence this country as, you know, bringing an end to the war, which we hope will take place soon. So as mentioned, I am a political and diplomatic correspondent for the Times of Israel, but I also spent some time as DC correspondent. I was living, you know, if you believe it or not, I was living in Maryland for more than 7 years. And I know your area. I love your area. I love, you know, Maryland State. I had 2 kids who were born there. Out of my 3 kids, and I wish I can go back and forth to the United States all the time. I do visit a lot. This year I was in the United States 3 times giving lectures, but also covering the election back at the end of 2024. And since I moved back to Israel from the United States at the end of 2009, I went back and forth every 4 years to cover campaigns, primaries, conventions. So I was following very closely the American politics and US and Israel relationship. I'm here today not to talk about your politics, which is complicated enough, but to talk about ours, which is very, very complicated. As a ground rule, I just want to explain that the political system or the governing system of Israel is very different from what you know in the United States. Israel, and this is something that you have to keep in your mind when you talk about Israel. Israel has a parliamentary system. As if you think about the British system, it's a system of coalition where in order to move ahead, the prime minister has to get his coalition partners on board. He has every step, he has to get coalition partners to move forward. He doesn't have all of the executive powers as the US president have, and he needs to get his coalition partners on board. Otherwise, his government may collapse at any time. And we don't have a constitution as opposed to the United States. This is a democracy without a constitution, meaning there is no protection under law for many issues. Hence, for example, you do not have to have election every 4 years. You can have election every year, depending on how the coalition holds it together. And what was mentioned just before is that between 2019 and 2022, just before this specific government, we had 5 election cycles because none of those coalitions that were put together, some of them by Netanyahu and just one by his other politicians, were not able to hold it together. And I'm saying it tonight because what we've seen last night coming from the White House may actually bring Netanyahu's coalition to an end even within days. I don't know that it's happening right now, but definitely Article 3 of the proposal that were put together by the Trump administration says that on the day that both Hamas and Israel, a terror organization, and our democratic country agree on the content of this agreement, of this proposal, on that day, this is the end of the war. And I'm saying it because 2 ministers representing 2 parties in Netanyahu's coalition said, and they said it many times during the last 2 years, if you will bring this war to an end, we will step down from your government. And this is, this is the reason we think, many Israeli, more than the majority of Israeli, they think that because of those threats that were made by his coalition partners, Netanyahu actually did not try up until now to bring the war to an end. Obviously, you all seen the devastating situation, both for the Israelis and for the Palestinians in Gaza, with the war raging on. And so in Israel, the politics and the defense or the war proceedings are they're complicated together. Every step that he makes, if his partners say, we are just leaving you behind, this is, maybe the reason that he was not willing to do it so far. So Netanyahu insisted through these 2 years that he's not ending the war, because he will only end the war when Hamas, the terror organization, is completely finished. And as we all know, what is completely finished. I mean, there's always people carrying guns inside Gaza. It's not like you can really finish all of them. So that is one of the reasons that, this is also complicated. He was opposing any type of announcement about the end of the war. Now, if this, having said that, we do not have a constitution, but we do have a law that says, it's called a basic law that says that we have election every 4 years. If Netanyahu is able to keep his government together, then the election will take place on October 2026. As of tomorrow, this is 12 months to go. So we enter election year anyhow. And since we are entering election year anyhow, everything is on the table. And some of his coalition partners may pull the trigger just beforehand and cause the collapse of the government. And then maybe election will be held on January 26th or March 26th or June 26th. We don't know the date yet. So again, unlike your system, when it's the first week or the Tuesday of the first week of November every 4 years, I think that's the way you phrase it. I'm not sure. So we don't have that. We can have election, within 100 days, like what they call snap election, within 100 days from now, or we can have them in June. Well, we don't know that yet. And for political reporters, you have to be on alert at all times, because you never know when the government may collapse. And indeed, again, between 2019 and 2022, we had 5 election cycles. Now, when you think of your election cycle just a year ago, how much hatred and how much, the public discourse is very vile, and, people just snap at each other, and maybe in family dinners or with friends or on the streets with demonstrations. And election is a type of event that causes huge damage to every sensitive society. I mean, free speech on one hand, and then people are hurting each other, not even to start to talk about real violence, when you had people shooting at the president twice during election. I mean, he was then not a contender, not a president at the time, but former president, but people shooting at the president, people shooting at one of a person who supports the president, for Charlie Kirk, of course, for what he says in a public event. And not to say that this is the same case here, but when you have election cycles, how the atmosphere is really, really tense among society. So, and when election ends, you expect people to just, take the temperature down and just stop being so at each other. But in Israel, imagine to yourself, we had this type of process 5 times. 5 times during 4 years. Can you imagine to yourself what it does to a society? And we finished 2022, exactly 3 years ago. We finished that year with a devastated, fractured society. So the society in Israel, to begin with, is very, very diverse. We have, I don't know if people know that, we have a minority of Arabs in Israel who are Arab citizens. And when I say Arabs, it's 21% of the society are Arabs. And when you look at this 21%, so every 5th citizen in Israel is an Arab. And when you look at this 21%, it is 19% Muslims, and the rest, the 2% are Bedouins, Druze, Christians, and others. So when I'm saying the minority of Arabs, I mean mostly Muslims, and 21%, I mean, so a fifth of the population is Muslims. And then you have all those kinds of different groups. You have Israel's secular and liberals. They may be lefty, they may be right wing. Then you have religious Zionists. This is people who, believe sometimes in the settlements movement. They believe in, religious influence on politics. We don't have separation between church and state like you have. But then among the religious people, you also have the ultra-Orthodox. And when I say ultra-Orthodox, they are very different from modern Orthodox. This is, something that you may know from the United States Jewry. It's different. It's ultra-Orthodox, they're a bit different. It's more like the Brooklyn ultra-Orthodox or the New York ultra-Orthodox, which, maybe you have seen them in real life or in movies. But this is what we have here. And so we have right wing, left wing, secular, religious, ultra-Orthodox, religious Zionists, which are very, very different from each other. And then we have also a big chunk of society, it's immigrants, people who came to Israel from, in recent years, I'm talking about 30, 40 years, who came mostly from Russia or France or Ethiopia. So Ethiopian Jews, Russian Jews, French Jews, and all of them, they may vote differently. Probably most of them right wing, but I don't want to presume to say because it's a diverse society. So all of those groups, so all of those divisions, immigrants, Israelis who were here before, secular, religious, ultra-Orthodox, religious Zionist, Muslims or Arabs, and Jews, and of course gender division. And having all of those groups at each other 5 times, when we got into January of 2023, we were in a deep trouble, very deep trouble. And on January 23, the new justice minister, just after election when Netanyahu won, the new justice minister at the time decided he will bring to Israel a new reform on the judicial system. This is something that you actually may know from the United States when you have all of this criticism about judges, about Israel's attorney general, and so on. He brought this in. He announced the judicial reform on first listening on early January 23. It was put to the public in a speech he made. Of course, under the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who supported that, and everything sounded like they're trying to strip away all of the civil rights and all of the independence of the judicial system, and they're going to strip away. They're going to take control on how to nominate judges. And again, I mentioned earlier, it's a different system from the United States. So here, the nominations are done by a very professional committee. They had this kind of 16 suggestions all across the board, how to take control of the media, take control of the judges, take control of judicial process, not allow people to appeal to the high court, block Palestinians in the West Bank from appealing to the high court, and so on and so forth. There are so many suggestions over there. Changing the legal counseling of all Israel's ministries to political appointee, and so on and so forth. People were shocked. And actually the justice minister himself, a couple of months later, said that if all of his suggestions were put forward and changed, this would change Israel into a dictatorship. He said it himself. And people were shocked, and they started to demonstrate, and they started to take it to the streets. This is early 2023, 10 months before the war. The demonstrations were very severe. Some of them were even, on the border of I wouldn't say very violent, but yeah, they were blocking roads. They were, they were chasing ministers on the streets. They were it was rough, very, very rough. And I think the most problematic point was many people started to say, if this is the case and we are turning into a dictatorship and you are stripping away our civil rights, freedom of speech, right to approach the court or right to have a due process and so on, we will not go and volunteer to the military anymore. This was a specific threat made by pilots, people in the Navy, people in all kinds of military, in cybersecurity military service. People said, military, it's a mandatory service when you are young, but later on you're volunteering. If the prime minister wants us to be his subordinates and we're not going to have a rights, then we are not going to do our duties as well. And they were like all of those calls to avoid military service. And I think Israel's neighbors, Lebanon, the terror organization in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the terror organization in Gaza, Hamas, they saw what's going on in Israel society. They were preparing their plan anyhow. And we had, the defense minister at the time had specific threats. He came to the prime minister and he said, I have specific warnings that all of our neighbors, they see what's going on. They see the Israeli society collapsing, really, without military, without protection. And Netanyahu, the prime minister at the time, he refused to listen. He said he was kind of he said, it's not real threats. They're just making those threats in order to put political pressure. I don't believe this. I don't trust this, so on and so forth. When some of the officers actually came to the Israel parliament to try to convince him to avoid one of those bills, it was a very harsh bill. They were trying to convince him to just they change course. He was not even willing to meet with them. That was on late July. Then during August, we had all of those warnings on the Israeli newspaper. It's all over the place. I mean, you can't, in these days, you can't really hide it. Even the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, had a video announcement early in September saying the situation on the borders is very, very severe. I will give you just one little anecdote. I was supposed to be in November of 23, I was supposed to be in the United States visiting synagogues for lectures. And I do this like twice a year, sometimes maybe sometimes more. And for the first time ever in my life, I asked the travel agent to purchase me an insurance for cancellation. I told him I'm supposed to be in November. We feel something is cooking up. Purchase me this cancellation fee because I am afraid that I won't be able to get there. I obviously then on September 23, I was traveling with the Israeli Prime Minister to the UN. Netanyahu at the time met Biden. Biden was very critical of Israel's judicial overhaul. He said it's not good for the people. He was engaging in that. He was putting the blame on Netanyahu publicly and privately. But also on this, at the same time, he was able to bring MBS, which is the leader of Saudi Arabia, who did not come to the UN, but Biden was able to bring MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, to start some sort of a normalization process with Israel. And that was the big news from the UN. I was there. I was looking at the TV in my hotel room and seeing MBS giving an interview to Fox News and saying, I will normalize relations with Israel. This is like September 18th, 2023. I went back to Israel on the eve of Yom Kippur, just exactly like today, a day before Yom Kippur. And I was like, oh my God, we are, maybe we're moving towards a new era. And then a week later, we had October 7th and everything collapsed. And when you look at October 7th, you think it may have, taken place because of this involvement with the Saudi Arabia, but also because of what I told you was the atmosphere, the really problematic situation internally in Israel. And I think Israel, did not recover from that day yet. It may take us many more years. We lost many people, many soldiers, many people that we knew. Friends and kids, sons and daughters of friends that I know, and And I go back to last night. This was, there was, I think one day when my mood was uplifted is when Biden landed in Israel 10 days after the atrocities, and his speech made us, I felt like there's someone I can look up to. And yesterday, when I was listening to President Trump for the second time, I was looking at him, and with all of the hoo-has around his speech and funny things that he says and the way he presents things, still, he was talking about peace, and he was talking about, he said how he listens to the Israeli people and how he see people are carrying his sign in demonstrations and calling him, help us. And that's true. That's very, very true. And the fact that, US president keeps saying we need peace, we need to calm the region, we need to put an end to the war. This is something very, very important to many Israelis. And I think that Trump was right on with the way he was, arranging things yesterday. And I think we should, at that time, we should probably try to take some question. And if there aren't any question, I can talk forever.
I know exactly what you mean. As a professor, I think that this is something that comes with a job. So let's take a step back with your permission, Tal. Thank you so much for this kind of opening intro so we can have this conversation. Let's take it back a bit to the political crisis of 2019, 2022, before we jump to the present, which is obviously perhaps more interesting to some people. What was the reason? Why were the political actors unable to form a coalition government or a unity government for that matter? What happened 5 times, one after the other? What was it? If you can pinpoint just one factor, or is it kind of 1 or 2 or 3? What was it all about?
So basically, Netanyahu was under corruption charges since 2017, I think, or 18. And it was, put on trial in a court in Israel. And many people from the center and the center left and even the right wing said, I'm not going to sit with the prime minister who is also need to be on trial because you are unable to carry on your duties as a prime minister because your discretion and your judgment is skewed because you have, and obviously when you look at the judicial overhaul, that this is first and foremost example how his judgment was skewed, because this reform that was put forward by his justice minister in many years since Netanyahu is prime minister since at least 2009, he was always talking about in very positive way about Israel's judicial system, how good it is, how merits, they have the merits, they are they can be people around the world should learn from Israel's judicial system. And he was opposing through his years as a prime minister. Many suggestions to ruin the judicial system came up, up and down, not together as such a big announcement, but every one and then every couple of years or months, someone came up with a suggestion. Let's strip some authorities, or let's do that. Let's change the attorney general situation and so on. And he was always blocking that. He said, no, the judicial system is our protector around the world, because if someone will ever take us to Hague, to the International Court of Law, or we get attacked at the UN, for what our soldiers are doing, then we have an attorney general to show for. She's prosecuting. I mean, today it's a she, it used to be a man. Even the military prosecution system, they put soldiers on trial if they're misbehaving. We need to keep the judges independent. If we don't have independent judges, then other countries around the world will arrest our soldiers and they will say, your judges are not enforcing the law. I mean, this is a specific risk for the Israeli society, as we all see right now. He was opposing. And then suddenly, on January 23, it was, for the first time, he said, yep, let's change the entire fabric of the judicial system. And obviously, his discretion was clouded by his corruption trial. And this is the reason that some of the politicians in Israel were completely unwilling to sit with him, because they said, we are not going to serve under a prime minister in such a situation. Then Netanyahu, this is his narrative. I mean, there's some options. You can say, if I'm unable to form a coalition 5 times or 4 times, so let someone else be prime minister. I mean, this is the British way, right? If the prime minister is unable to get along, then she moves out of the way. Liz Truss, I think, or another one.
Yep.
They move out of the way and give someone else the opportunity to be prime minister. We are not a country that needs just only one person, Bibi, Bibi, Bibi. No, this option was off the table for him. The other option was, if I'm unable to sit with centrists, I will take all of these extreme people to be in my government, namely the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich and the current Homeland Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. And when I say extreme, in case you guys don't know, Itamar Ben-Gvir was convicted in incitements and terror-related felonies 8 times. 8 times this person was convicted. So this is not just someone. This is someone who was actually part of a plot to murder Rabin at 1995. This is someone that is coming from the marginal of the Israeli society, very, very extreme. Just for example, even these days when we want to release hostages, he keeps saying that he doesn't, he votes against. I mean, when we had 250 people inside Gaza, women and kids, and we had the youngest was 2 years old and the eldest was 86 years old, he voted against their release from captivity. I mean, this is the level of extremist guy that is a partner with Netanyahu these days. No one would ever imagine he would sit in a government. And the other minister, also very, very extreme, Bezalel Smotrich, just about 10 days ago, he said, we will take Gaza. It's not ours, right? But he wants to annex that. I want to, and he said it in his own words. It's not even, I'm just quoting him. He said, I will share Gaza with the Americans. We will do percentage sharing, as if he is real estate agent or something, because we put a lot of money into this war. So I want to have a share of Gaza. And he also said, when you have a new construction, you have to do the destruction, and the phase of destruction is behind us, meaning obviously, I mean, such a terrible way of talking about what is taking place for people on the other side. Horrific. And I mean, and this is a minister in Israel. And if you think this is just Israeli thing, I mean, it's all over CNN all the time. We're watching it in English. People translate him and put it up. And this is the face of our country. It's horrible. And those two may step down next week if Netanyahu insists on the plan. And
yeah, so I'm kind of trying to follow up on some questions from the audience. You talked about Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Can you map their interests? So the coalition partners, a coalition government basically means that we have different parties that come together and they seek to achieve different goals. They have different objectives, and perhaps there's a common denominator or ideological or whatever, but they seek to achieve something of their own, some kind of sectorial or sectoral. Can you map these interests moving or going into this term of this government in early 2023? What did they want to achieve? What was most important for each one of these partners?
Right. So the way it goes in Israel when you have election, on election day, I know in the United States on election day, maybe within a day or maybe sometimes it takes 3-4 days, but then until the end of the week, who is the winner. You count the delegates and the electoral college and you come up to a number. Here it's not the same, since there is election and each party gets its numbers, and then you have to get from election day, you have about 2 to 3 months to build a coalition. And the coalition can be comprised from many parties. And in order to comprise this coalition, in order to get it together, you come up with a paper that we call it the coalition agreement. This is like an outline of very specific intentions of each party, which you just called, each party represents a sector, and they are trying to come up with some sort of an agreement that everybody can agree on. It's very, very complicated process. So for example, religious Zionists by Smotrich, they would care about settlement, so they would put into this agreement, we want to have, lots of buildings in settlements. We want to have annexation inside the West Bank, and we want to, this kind of things. And the Likud, which is a secular, semi-secular, kind of a traditional conservative, they would put, for example, taxation issues, and they would put immigration also. It's a big deal here with how do you close the border from coming from people who try to get into the country from Africa. I mean, we've been into that building of a fence probably like 15 years before the United States. So that used to be a big deal. And, maybe healthcare systems and so on. And ultra-Orthodox, on the other hand, they would care about the draft because there is a mandatory military service, and they want to get an exemption. So the first and foremost important section for them will be, how do we get exempt from military service? They also want to have a lot of, what to do about, religious atmosphere, like, kosher food, and what do you do on a Saturday, which is a Shabbat, where people are observing, and so on. And education, they want to get a lot of money for private education. So the prime minister, or the someone who is elected to be the prime minister, needs to get this all of those different sectors into one paper, and then according to that paper, they move on for the next 4 years, if it is 4 years. What happened in Israel, for example, the judicial overhaul was not mentioned in the campaign at all. I mean, it was not even part of the campaign. No one said anything about this during the campaign. But when they wrote the coalition agreement, suddenly it popped in with a general term saying they're going to reform the courts. People didn't know what it meant. And then when the government starts to work, they look at this founding paper and they refer to, each section. Obviously, on October 7th, when the massacre took place and the war began, everything collapsed. Everything they put into that paper were no longer relevant. So this is how the prime minister is trying to rule the situation. He never promised in the coalition agreement to Smotrich or to Ben-Gvir that the war will go forever, because we did not have a war at the time. Having said that, I think the next coalition agreement after next election will probably say, we will bring an end to the war, if it's not Bibi, of course. I mean, we will bring, because all of the other politicians, then they now promise to end the war. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to kind of to connect a couple of questions, kind of create a hybrid question. So you map the interests of these different groups, or these different coalition partners. So my question to you is, do they have an interest now to bring down the government? Somebody
No.
says, somebody said, some in the question say, at this point in time, they would have anticipated the Israeli government to fall, right? The major failure of October 7th. So, but do the partners themselves now, politically, do they have an incentive to go and collapse the government and go for elections?
No, quite the opposite. They have an interest to stick together. The problem is that, for Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, what's happening now in the government is opposing to everything they promised. Not promises made before elections, but promises made during the last 2 years with respect to how do you, for example, they keep promising, we will finish off Hamas. We will not stop the war until Hamas is completely finished. And what is the definition of completely finished? I mean, who knows? So, I mean, this is a problematic promise they made. And right now, or for example, Smotrich himself says, I want to annex, we want to build settlements inside Gaza. I mean, he can say all of those crazy things, totally unrelated to reality. But now when things going in the opposite direction, and when President Trump sits in the Oval Office and say no annexation whatsoever, Smotrich has this kind of political problem. Are you in with a government that is adhering by Trump's no annexation, or are you out? Because as long as you stay in, you are part of this government. And again, as opposed to the American system, this is not just a one-person executive branch, because the government is comprised of all of those parties, and they all share the responsibility for the decision. Once they sign, for example, once they sign an agreement with the Hamas terror organization, all of the ministers, as long as they didn't step down, are part of this agreement. And this is on them. If the agreement collapses and it's not working, it's them to blame. They can never say, not a problem, we opposed it. Even if they voted against it in the government, but they stayed in the government, it's their responsibility. And in Israel, they try to kind of always blame the IDF, the military. This is not our fault, it's their fault, and so on. But basically, it's under the law, it's their responsibility.
Yeah, sure. There's a comment made that by Mady Segal, who's a very good friend of ours here, and she's very disturbed with what Benjamin Netanyahu has been doing. And I would kind of tag that together with another question about the opposition in Israel. We see the polls, and they're very critical of this government and Benjamin Netanyahu particularly. The level of trust that people have with Benjamin Netanyahu is pretty low, in the 20s perhaps, kind of the hardcore base perhaps. What is the role of the opposition in leveraging that towards bringing down the government? If this is a parliamentary government and you need a vote of confidence, why have they failed for the past couple of years to change the reality, the political reality, and bring about some change, ousting Benjamin Netanyahu, or at least encouraging some reshuffle within the coalition, or his removal, creating coalitions or agreements and alliances with somebody else from Likud, for example?
Right. So in the last, I guess, 50 years, I think most of the governments in Israel were right-wing, I think 95% of the time, maybe just a little time during Rabin 3 years, then Ehud Barak for 1 year, and another 1 year by kind of a split right-wing, left-wing government, what we call the change government in 2021. So other than that, it was always the Likud, or the Likud with some sort of combinations, but always right wing. So when you say opposition in Israel, you actually mean the left most of the time. The left has been unable to get back into government. And the opposition in Israel, historically, it's very low under it doesn't have many authorities in the Israeli parliament. It can do a good fight, but for example, filibuster rules are not as strong as in the United States. So I mean, the coalition can easily override filibuster with what they call emergency situation, and it's always emergency here. Can you think of a time it's not an emergency? Can you think of a month without a terror attack in Israel? No, I cannot. So there's always security reasons, can always override the opposition. I think in the last probably 10 years, since a little bit less than 10, since the prime minister was indicted, opposition. Basically, the opposition is in the streets. It's very strong civil society demonstrations in the streets. Obviously, opposition members, they join them. You can see them on the streets as well. But the Israeli public is very, how do you say that? Is very engaged in demonstrations, basically. And people, when they go to a lot of demonstrations, mostly lefty, and when they demonstrate, they keep asking, it's not helpful, we're never going to win, always the right wing wins. But for example, I think the judicial overhaul, for example, was halted because of the huge public criticism. And now in hindsight, almost 3.5 years later, we get some things that were said indoors by some of those ministers, and we know they made the claim, you cannot put that bill right now. I mean, justice minister is another minister. You cannot put this bill right now because of, you see the demonstrations, or I mean, those demonstrations reached Biden. I'm talking about the demonstrations about the judicial overhaul. They reached Biden. Biden and other European leaders, they were very impressed for what they saw, and they started to say, you cannot ruin Israel like that. Even last night, if you were watching Trump, at a certain point, Trump said, I see the demonstrations on the Israeli streets. I see people in Israel carrying signs with my name,
Yeah,
and
he
they
said,
say,
they love me. He said, they
they
love me
love
here.
me. It's
They love me.
true. It's
Right.
true. They say they love me. They want me to help. I mean, people here there is a regular demonstration across the street from the US Embassy with the signs and the names of the hostages, and with those signs on the beach, and they do like a huge, a lot of efforts and a lot of money is being poured into those demonstrations. And they are actually the opposition in Israel. I think when you ask about the real opposition in the parliament,
Yeah.
they have limited powers. Another type of opposition may be the press. Obviously, the Israeli media, it's not completely against the government. It's like, it's split. Like in other countries, you have a media that is pro-government, but you have also a very strong media that is against the government, and it's also noisy, and make a lot of research and a lot of investigative reporting. So I mean, many of those ministers who have problems right now with the law, it's because of the media. So I mean, when you describe the opposition in Israel, you cannot really talk about just Yair Lapid as the opposition leader.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me tie this question of opposition and the prospects of perhaps changing the political scenery now in Israel, given the nature of the opposition or the lack thereof in the parliament, or its inability. You talked about the Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 20-something% of the population. One of the things that happened in the past couple of years, this is under Naftali Bennett, was the inclusion of Mansour Abbas as a member of the coalition, for the first time ever, a member of a coalition from an Arab or a Palestinian party. How do you see that play out moving forward? For example, when Benny Gantz, not Benny Gantz, but Yair Lapid and Yair Golan and others and Lieberman meet to devise plans how to overthrow this government, for example, they don't invite Mansour Abbas. And when they say, well, we'll form the next coalition government, and Naftali Bennett says, but it's not going to include any Arabs, what does that mean about the prospects of change or the political game in Israel?
Right. So let me just start by saying that we have 21% of the population is, as I said earlier, is Arab. You don't expect them to be just one bloc. They have several parties for themselves. And one of them is Mansour Abbas. Actually, it's a highly Muslim religious party, a more religious type. Think of a mirror of very religious evangelists, maybe, like people that, stick with, going to church or going to mosque or going to synagogue, and keep all of the custom and tradition very strict, and adhere to their own imam, which is like a rabbi or a pastor. And Mansour Abbas, and actually in Israel, those religious Muslims are more moderate and more accommodating than other Arab parties. Other Arab parties are more of, one of them is a socialist party, and another one is actually a party that may be disqualified next time because they go out against the country. They are like living in Israel, citizens of Israel, but they have a lot of criticism of the country, and they are unwilling to participate in the game. So they go for election, but they are too much to the extreme side, and they preach against the country and so on and so forth. So when you have those, three major parties, they usually do not sit together. But in order to overcome some legal procedures, at one time they went together. What they did is like they joined forces to a common list, a common party. It's not really a party. It's like three different parties, three different factions sitting together only to overcome the threshold rules. They did it. They gained more seats. The Arab public in Israel really loved this move. And when they are apart, as you said, the religious faction was in the government for the first time in Israel's history. Next time they may run together again, and there will be a problem to join forces with them because, as I said, a third faction is really going out against the country, and even if they're disqualified or not disqualified, it's going to be a huge problem. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the situation in Israel at the moment is very sensitive, and unfortunately, I mean, after such an horrific massacre and very, very difficult war, some prejudice, and people take it out on Israeli Arab citizens. I mean, they take it on them with respect to in the discourse. It's not, they don't do anything, but the discourse is very hostile.
Yeah.
And for that reason, they think that, the correct phrase is they're going to have a majority not leaning on Ra'am. Ra'am is the religious Arab faction. And some of the parties say that if you have a majority without them, then you can add them in. So it means that the government is not reliant on them. The government, the coalition may have Arabs in it, but not in a way that they can topple the government. If it's reliant on them, they can topple the government, then you are reliant on Arabs' interest, and this is the problem. And also, I want to stress that many parties, they have in the party list for nominations, they have Arab participants, not in a good representative way, but they enter some. I mean, at least in the liberal left, what they call themselves the Democrats, but it's Labour and Meretz. They always have someone who is either Muslims or Druze or Bedouin. And also, for example, in the right wing of Israel Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman, he also has a Druze up on the list. So Arabs in Israel, the 21%, they can vote, they can choose their own representative parties, Muslims, or they can vote. I mean, some of them vote liberal, some of them, even the Likud has voters, even Shas, the Israeli Jewish religious Orthodox, have Arab voters. So it's not confined to just voting for Arabs. You can do whatever you want, and we'll see. I mean, I think some of the things that they say with respect to the Arabs before election, they don't follow up on their words after the election, meaning...
Sure, absolutely. And the case in point was Benjamin Netanyahu's approach to Mansour Abbas, who said, please join me. And when he said, no, I'm going to join Naftali Bennett, then it became kind of illegitimate in a sense, right?
I mean, it's like a discourse. It's a very hostile and unfortunate discourse, which I don't like. But this discourse may go away after the election if it's in the political interest to have Mansour Abbas from Ram, part of the government. He has proven himself during the war and overall to be very, very moderate and very, someone that you can do really good dialogue with, and very soft-spoken person. If you follow up on him, it's amazing speeches that he gives, and a very kind person. So let's hope for the best from him and from them.
Alrighty, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about kind of the international, the diplomatic side of this conversation, right? So there was a plan that was introduced yesterday in the White House, 20 points or 20 different articles or elements, if you like. David Siegel, who's also a good friend of ours over here at the Institute, says, do you think that Hamas will accept the proposal imposed on them without their participation? And if that bars the creation of a Palestinian state, and would the Knesset support such a proposal? In other words, is there a majority in the Israeli Knesset or in the Israeli public, if you'd like to comment about that, in favor of a Palestinian state? And where is Benjamin Netanyahu on this, right? We can talk about the Bar Ilan speech. We can talk about other things, other claims that he made, Kerry's mission 2012, 2013. And yesterday at the White House, it was an integral part that there's a kind of a diplomatic horizon of Palestinian self-determination. How do you square all these kind of contradictory elements?
So first, you know how they kept on talking on 21 points up until last night? You know, like
Yeah.
21 points, 21 points. So when we opened the paper, the White House sent the paper and I opened it and I was like, where is the 21st point?
There's one missing. Yeah, absolutely.
One missing. So do you know what it is? Apparently, it was the apology that the Israeli prime minister was supposed to give to the Qatari people, the Qatari prime minister. And since he gave it on the phone before the press conference, they deleted that from the from the point and it went down. So one point down. You know, we can mark done.
Yeah.
I mean, there was some shock in Israel with respect to his apology. It's also, you know, part of the political debate at the moment. Qatar, I mean, it's a high debate here in Israel where people think that he, you know, I mean, those people in Qatar were terrorists. He was trying to kill them. It's failed. Why would he apologize? Qatar should apologize to the Israeli and so on and so forth. That's one political problem for him. You know, if you jump right into a Palestinian state, I have to tell you, when you read the paper, the Palestinian state, the pathway to coexistence in the future of something that the president will try to bring the sides together. This is the most vague phrasing that I've ever seen in a diplomatic paper since I've been covering, you know, those back and forth diplomacy shuttling, trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinians issue. I've never seen something so vague and so deferred. I mean, it will only take place after the Palestinian Authority will be reformed and how they call it
De-radicalization. Yep.
Process. And I mean, come on, it can take ages for that to happen. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems that it was put in there to satisfy Arab countries, but it was, you know, it was framed and phrased in a way that it's not on the table. And then Netanyahu on his speech yesterday made sure that everybody understands that he is against the Palestinian state. And Trump said, yeah, I know you are, but we'll talk about it later. So, I mean, if you check Netanyahu's speeches at the UN, at the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly over the years, you will find his commitment to a two-state solution up until like 2016 or 17.
Right.
So as you mentioned, you have the Bar-Ilan speech in 2009, but even after that, when he went to the UN, he always said that. Did he mean that? No, obviously he did not mean it. He was not, he didn't want to go, you know, full blown out against it. But so he was saying it. I think things that he said over the years were said in order to appease people. So he said two-state solution. He did not believe in that. Now he say he doesn't believe in two-state solution. You know, Netanyahu is not the most trustworthy person. I mean, if he would see the Israeli public rooting for two-state solution, he will change. But the Israeli public is not rooting for that. That I can tell you that. If you look and for that specific note, I think Netanyahu is actually right when he says over interviews in the United States and also in others instances, he says that even the Israeli left is opposing this at the moment, and that's true. Because even if you look at the liberals, lefty-headed, the Democrats, what they call themselves, the Labor, they say, for example, they were always for two-state solution, but after the war, they said, yes, maybe, but not now, maybe in the future. And I mean, it's basically right now there is, you know, loss of trust with the Palestinians, a complete loss of trust. There is no way to fix that in just because you have a paper that says, you know, a ceasefire. Obviously, I'm not even talking about Gaza. This is like completely off the table. But even in the West Bank, people are anxious, afraid from, you know, there's terror attack in Israel almost every day. There was one today, one yesterday. People are being wounded and killed coming from terrorists. And the Israeli grip on the West Bank is also very difficult. So, I mean, the situation in the West Bank and the situation, I mean, people have to understand. I mean, if you're listening to me and you don't know the geopolitics of the area, we've been under rockets and attacks from Lebanon, Hezbollah, from Syria with Iranian forces inside Syria, from Iran, obviously, from Iraq. This is just the last 2 years, right? From Iraq with Iranian militias in Iraq. We've been shot at from Yemen, which, is a country that is not even close to here. And we had no idea where it is when the war began. I mean, it's far away. We have no business with them. We don't care about their, we have nothing against them or for them. They just started shooting at us. And of course, from Gaza and terror from the West Bank. And, you show me another country that is facing 7 fronts like that and is being able to just announce, yes, let's, give the other side a state. And I'm not for Netanyahu in any way, but this is, it's a concept that, it cannot take place. I mean, the situation here is so, at the moment, so volatile and so fragile. It's something that I don't see, even if the left would win and be a prime minister for the next 20 years, I don't see an Israeli prime minister from the left being able to proceed with that.
Okay, so we're running out of time. So let me ask you kind of a couple of questions. One is difficult, perhaps, challenging more. Perhaps the other one is a bit riskier in a way. The first one, based on some of the questions from the audience, what is driving Benjamin Netanyahu? What makes him tick, so to speak, from a political perspective? How do you see that?
I think he's a fan of history, and he thinks that he is the big protector of this country, and he's always talking about how, the effect of World War II and the Nazism rise and the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews. He thinks that this is his job in the world to make sure that the Jewish people never get destroyed like that. It was very successful up until 2 years ago, and then came October 7th and complete a huge failure on his behalf, where we were on that day, and then the weeks following that, we were we felt like 7 countries are going to invade at once and just take everybody captive, and it was horrifying. So I mean, you really feel claustrophobic here in a way. And Netanyahu is always playing on this fear, which he knows every Israeli is carrying, but he also sees himself in a historic role. I think this is what ticks for him. Also, I suppose he likes power, like many politicians around the world. I mean, he thinks that he really believes that he is the only person who can do this job, where obviously I completely disagree, because we had prime ministers before him and we will have prime ministers after him. And right now, he's not fit for the job because of his massive failure on October 7th, but also because of the corruption charges and many other issues. But he failed completely 2 years. He failed this country. I mean, he promised to protect the country, and I mean, this is the most difficult and horrific war ever. And if people do not remember, let me just say that entire region in Israel was conquered by the enemy for 24 hours. 1,200 people were slaughtered in their beds or in their homes or in their yards, and 251 people were kidnapped while, hiding under the bed or hiding in the closet. I think like around 50 kids lost both parents, and people lost brothers and sisters, and the military completely failed. Also, the IDF was completely, a huge failure on that day. So, I mean, this is all under his leadership. And so the historic role that he tapped himself into, he failed on that.
All righty. I wanted just to go to ask you a kind of a riskier question, but there's somebody asked a question in the chat box. I want to rephrase it a bit with your permission. Can you talk about the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu? There seems to be kind of a bond on the one hand. Some argue, critics of the administration here in the United States, and certainly of the prime minister, argue that he's kind of like a puppeteer. He's controlling Trump. That is, Benjamin Netanyahu is controlling Trump. On the other hand, we saw Trump forcing Netanyahu's hand and demanding an apology to the Qatari government that actually was executed, as you said, and was omitted from the 21-point that became a 20-point document. So what's the relationship there? Who's the stronger, who's the more influenced, or the more influencer in that relationship, in that duo?
So yeah, Israel is a tiny country. We are 10 million. It's tiny, tiny. It's, I think we have we have probably around the area of Maryland, maybe.
Or New Jersey. I think that New Jersey is a
New
classical.
Jersey,
I think
they're
map.
talking
Yeah,
about the
something. I think
land
it can
area.
fit into New Jersey. I think I had.
And yeah, and we're 10 million. This is like Austria or Greece, I think. Small size country. And whoever thinks that Netanyahu is controlling Trump is just kidding himself. I think Netanyahu is ego, maybe. Sometimes Netanyahu's ego. I mean, Netanyahu is probably the world longest serving leader. I can't think, maybe Erdogan even started after him. Maybe Putin, who was prime minister before he was president. But other than that, I mean, Angela Merkel is, she retired, or even in China, they changed more. And I think Netanyahu feels very secure, or, he believes that the regime is for him forever. I mean, and he also maybe he thinks that he will have endless life. I don't know. I mean, so I don't think, so this ego and the situation where he has, you can't ignore that he has massive experience. I mean, Clinton, Bush, Trump, Obama, Biden. I
They came
mean,
and went, and he stayed. He's the constant in Israeli politics.
exactly. So he has this, massive experience, and but obviously any American president is much stronger than him on day one. Biden was stronger than him, and I think the failure of the Qatari attack has, kind of wake up Trump. I think Trump and Netanyahu, they had their quarrels, and there is a very famous quote that Trump was pissed of him, but also after the Iranian war in June this year, Trump really, was blessing Netanyahu for the achievement and so on. But I think those two leaders, they're aligned in their hate to the media, and they're aligned in this is us against the judicial system. This is us against the UN. This is us against international bodies, because as you know, Israel is very, very upset with the UN, or with the European Union, or with the world, international courts and so on. So this type of atmosphere, this is, you have the America first. In Israel, they don't say Israel first, but it's because of this isolation of this country. The entire atmosphere is this is us against the world, and it's the same mindset. This is me against the judicial system. And Trump went through his trial in New York. Netanyahu is undergoing this trial here. The conservative movements, we don't have a MAGA, but it's this entire echelon of supporters and people who admire you. But then Netanyahu really knows how to compliment Trump. But I have to tell you, even the protesters in Israel learned how to compliment Trump. They're carrying signs with Trump, and obviously it's working. So, I mean, Netanyahu is not the only one who can compliment him. And I think they're aligned in conservative issues, and in this, and it, it makes them feel good with each other.
All righty, so we're out of time, but so this is the risky question that I had for you, or the challenges, if you wish. You said that, elections in Israel are scheduled for October 2026. Will they happen sooner? Will they take place sooner? Will the Israeli government, this government, complete its term, has another year, or not? And this is on record, so we're going to record this. We're going to absolutely.
I think the fact that they're going on for 3 years, it's a huge achievement, because after the war, we know the first thing we thought that they will collapse because of the situation here that was so dire. So I mean, in Israel, none of the governments makes it to 4 years. It's very rare to make it into the fourth year. This is maybe one of the only, I never expected Netanyahu to be able to keep it together for 4 years. I would say that probably the election will take place on June because I think Netanyahu will not be able to pass the budget, and we're going to have this some sort of a shutdown like you may have. And then with the shutdown, you have mandatory elections. If they're in Israel, if you go into a shutdown of a budgeted shutdown, then the mandatory elections pop up under the law. And it's very hard to change that law. So, you know, we're no constitution, but nothing will help. So maybe, but again, I'm unwilling to completely give you. So the government may collapse by the end of March and then election on June. But, you know, election on June 26th to election on October, it's really nothing you know, and it's, for me, it's like a complete term, which we never thought he would be able to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tal Schneider, for all your insights. Before we adjourn, I just want to thank you once again for joining us today, for sharing your thoughts and your analysis. A reminder that the next webinar will take place on October 9th. It will feature Dr. Chuck Freilich, who will talk about October 7th, 2023, Israel in the United States, 2 years later, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Please, for more information and to register, visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Thank you so much, you all, for attending.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful, blessed day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Tal.